In recent years, many conservative commentators have characterized the Western trend towards woke ideology as a sign that the West is becoming too collectivist. Specifically, they associate these trends with a Marxification of society. However, it is worth pointing out that modern left wing ideologies have very little, if anything, in common with traditional collectivist cultures. This is especially evident when you consider the fact that Eastern collectivist cultures are much more resistant to radical social change than individualist Western cultures. Instead, I would argue that the current Western trend towards woke ideology is actually a byproduct of the evolution of Western individualism rather than collectivism. But first, we will need to define collectivism and individualism. Collectivist cultures are distinguished by their emphasis on conformity and prioritizing of the collective's interests before one's own interests. This doesn't mean individuals don't get to have their own perspectives. It usually just means prioritizing the maintenance of social harmony, even if it comes at the expense of one's own personal freedom. In practice, this often means we are obligated to follow the guidance of authoritative institutions. These authoritative institutions could be one's traditional culture, community, family, or government. Failure to maintain social harmony with these institutions often results in severe societal judgment or stigma. Thus, people who live in these cultures often tend to keep their personal disagreements private rather than reveal them to the public. Thus, you tend to see less protesting in collectivist cultures. Such cultures tend to experience social change at a much slower pace than more individualist cultures. They tend to hold on to their cultural traditions much more strongly than individualist cultures. Individualist cultures are distinguished by their emphasis on the pursuit of personal freedom. Rather than subjugating one's perspectives and interests to societal expectations, one is encouraged instead to express and pursue them more or less freely. As a result, you tend to see more personal expression and greater individual variability from person to person. In an individualist society, you will encounter people with more diverse beliefs and practices. Innovators are allowed to innovate and businesses are allowed to conduct business as they see fit. Hobbyists are allowed to enjoy their hobbies with little stigma, and protesters are allowed to protest with fewer restrictions. Such a permissive cultural environment facilitates the free exchange of ideas and practices. New innovative ideas tend to facilitate faster growth in technology, as well as economic prosperity. Thus, social change tends to spread faster in individualist societies. But at the same time, social trends and practices also tend to fall out of fashion faster as well. Since there are few constraints on individuals, it is harder to maintain cultural traditions in an individualistic society. It is also harder to maintain tight-knit communities since people are no longer expected to remain in their communities. To have a better understanding of Western society's recent trend towards woke ideology, one should look at how Western societies, especially American society, has evolved over time. It can be argued that historically, most cultures around the world gravitated towards some form of collectivism rather than individualism. Although traditional European cultures may not have been as collectivist as feudal Japan, they were still collectivist compared to modern Western culture. It was through the collectivist emphasis on maintaining social harmony that they were able to preserve their old cultural traditions and beliefs. Individuals were encouraged to believe the same things older generations believed and had an obligation to carry on traditions that were passed down. Although they might have had minor disagreements here and there, most people were willing to comply, especially since their traditional narratives were all they really knew, and there weren't too many alternatives available to them. In many cases, failure to conform to societal tradition was stigmatized or even outright punished. Rigid societal structures such as feudalism also facilitated this conformity. Since this type of collectivist culture seeks to maintain itself and prevent change from occurring, It can be said that this is a conservative collectivist paradigm. However, the 18th century saw the rise of a new intellectual and philosophical and political movement known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment marked Western society's shift from conservative collectivism towards a new era of individualism that placed a greater value on the perspectives and interests of individuals. The Enlightenment embraced new scientific innovations and provided Europeans with a new way of discovering the truth, aside from just relying on old narratives from previous generations. The Enlightenment encouraged the loosening of feudal social hierarchies and fostered the spread of capitalism, a form of economic individualism that would spread upward mobility to the commoners, thus making it easier for commoners to rise through social ranks, as long as they had enough capital. Republicanism and democracy were championed as rational alternatives to monarchy, tools for the political liberation of the people. Likewise, science would serve as the key to liberating society from the tyranny of ignorance, thus allowing the proliferation of technology that would not only raise the standard of living, but also allow humans to achieve feats never thought possible. However, it's also worth noting that the Enlightenment thinkers were not all radicals who wanted to overthrow everything in society. Most of them still believed in maintaining some cultural tradition. Although their brand of individualism empowered individuals to overcome oppressive social structures, they still believed that individuals should continue to value the traditional wisdom laid down by their predecessors, especially if there's no guarantee that the new way of doing things is objectively better. This self-moderating approach to individualism very much reflects the American approach to societal progress and governance, which saw the transition from colonial monarchism to constitutional republicanism. It is very much the theoretical core of what we often think of as classical liberalism or American conservatism. Thus, we can think of this as the conservative individualist paradigm. For much of American history, American society was marked by a balancing of conservative collectivism among older generations and the conservative individualism of younger generations. While the slave-owning gentry of the South wanted to preserve the institution of slavery, abolitionists wanted to create a society that was free from such inhumane and archaic practices. While patriarchs wanted to maintain a society where only men could vote, feminists advocated for women's right to vote and work in jobs they were previously barred from entering. Although much of American history was filled with social and political strife, it was mutually agreed upon that as long as American society adhered to Christianity and the Constitution, ongoing discourse regarding whether we need to reform or maintain the status quo could be allowed. Even if Americans disagreed with each other politically, their shared cultural and religious beliefs would allow them to maintain a community together. As a result, for much of American history, save the Civil War, most Americans lived in relatively tight-knit communities that got along reasonably well, despite their differences. In the 1960s, a new philosophical movement began to spread among the baby boomer generation, particularly within the halls of academia. A movement that would coalesce into what we now know as postmodernism. Although postmodernism is not a monolith, it can generally be described as a rejection of the ways of thinking that characterize traditional society. Traditional institutions like religion, culture, science, family, community, country, and capitalism were all subject to postmodern critique and skepticism. Rejecting both traditionalism and modern rationalism, postmodernists adopted a more relativistic view of the world and argued that one's cultural traditions and norms were no more valid than any other culture. Likewise, one's subjective perspectives were just as valid as any objective fact. Since no value system was inherently superior and all were subjective, there was no longer a need to preserve traditional customs. Any traditional institution could be critiqued and ultimately discarded with little consequence. This relativistic view of life ultimately manifested itself in the countercultural revolution of the 1960s, Although the counterculture revolution began with the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, it quickly came to include all sorts of movements that went against the status quo. Women's liberation, gay liberation, the sexual revolution, and the normalization of drug culture all were fair game in this period of liberalization. The overall theme was that traditional societal constraints were unnecessary and could be discarded if doing so served the purpose of personal liberation. That individuals should be free to pursue whatever makes them happy. Individuals could pursue whatever career they wanted, live whatever lifestyle they wanted, do whatever drugs they wanted, have sex with whoever they wanted. The sky was the limit. No individual pursuit was objectively better or worse than any other. Anyone who passed judgment was seen as a curmudgeon or worse, an oppressor. This shift towards illiberal individualism facilitated the greatest rise in personal liberty. But on the other hand, it also opened the floodgates for societal changes that were not anticipated. This brand of liberal individualism is often represented by modern liberalism. As the older generations passed away and baby boomers came into power, the conservative collectivism of the older generations was replaced by conservative and liberal individualism. Although American society now enjoyed a greater degree of personal freedom and less social stigma than before, it did come with its own share of problems. Under the conservative collectivism and individualism paradigm, disagreements within society were addressed within the confines of the Constitution, national identity, and shared Christian faith. But the deconstructionist philosophy of liberal individualism undermined the perceived legitimacy of these traditional institutions. Thus, it became increasingly acceptable for individuals to abandon traditional institutions that previously maintained social harmony and kept societies together. People were now free to create, adopt, pursue their own values and interests. Thus, the importance of maintaining a tight-knit community where everyone shared common values became increasingly seen as archaic and stifling. Individuals were encouraged to pursue whatever they wanted as long as it made them happy. The new liberated individual could pursue their own interests whenever and wherever they pleased. If that meant weakening one's ties to family and community, so be it. If your community didn't approve of your lifestyle, you were free to leave that community and pursue happiness elsewhere. Corporations, no longer feeling obligated to remain loyal to local communities, could now outsource jobs to foreign countries to ensure greater profit margins. And as these jobs left these communities, so did young people. Although conservative individualists were largely opposed to these societal trends, they were hesitant to oppose them as strongly as previous generations, especially since many of them profited from these arrangements. Thus, it was reasoned that if traditional values no longer served as the glue that would keep society together, at least economic prosperity via capitalism would make society more materially prosperous. Thus, we saw the erosion of traditional communities and an erosion of a unified national identity. Instead, we saw the rise of financialism and consumerism, the rise of single-parent households, and the atomization of society. Instead of tight-knit communities, we have economic zones. Communities previously united by shared values were now united only by available economic opportunities. Unified national interests gave way to partisan special interest groups. Thus, the Republican-Democrat partisan divide that has dominated American politics over the last several decades is the end product of this paradigm shift. While the baby boomers continued to preside over the conservatism and liberalism paradigm, the millennial generation had been fighting to leave its own imprint on society. Like the baby boomers, they believed they could change the world and were willing to do so. Many millennials, fresh out of college and riddled with student debt, advocated for an even more progressive approach to individualism. This was a generation that grew up in a society where tight-knit communities were a thing of the past. They did not derive their sense of identity from a geographic or cultural community. They did not derive their identity from religion or traditional values. They inherited postmodern relativism and liberal individualism from the boomers. As a result, they filled this communal void by finding their identity in youth subcultures. When they outgrew those subcultures and realized that adult life would be marked by unaffordable cost of living and social isolation, many took on new identities. One of the most prominent sources of identity was through identity politics, a practice primarily derived from a school of philosophy known as critical theory or woke ideology. From critical theory, we see the rise of what can be called progressive individualism. Like a liberal individualist, progressive individualists do not see the value of traditional institutions. But unlike liberal individualists, who are largely apathetic, progressive individualists view traditional institutions as violent, oppressive forces that must be eradicated in order to liberate the individual from the bonds of systemic oppression. Rather than just simply abandoning tradition, they seek to dismantle it and replace it with woke institutions. Only when traditional institutions have been replaced will they achieve a society where individuals are free to do whatever they want, without having to fear being stigmatized or marginalized. But as a result of their hostile attitude to society, what little connection they have to family and community is ultimately destroyed, necessitating the formation of new communities. From critical theory, they derive their communal identity from their racial and gendered victimhood. When that isn't enough, they expand it to include things like sexual orientation and gender identity. Within their intersectional victim identity, they seek communal bonds via shared trauma and oppression. To ensure that oppressed individuals can flourish, they advocate for inclusivity in all domains. Ironically, these woke communities have little to no tolerance for disagreement, perceiving almost all disagreements as hate speech that seeks to oppress them. To remain a member of their community requires one to conform to their ideology at the expense of everything else, thus ironically dooming them to a false sense of individualism that is actually closer to collectivist groupthink. But unlike traditional collectivists, they share no genuine bonds rooted in traditional culture or history. Their communal bonds are largely tied to woke ideology at the expense of everything else. Where we currently stand is at a transitional phase where the competition between conservatism and liberalism is being further complicated by the rise of woke progressivism. Although conservatives are still battling it out with liberals, liberals are also being chastised by younger progressives for not being woke enough. However, recent trends have indicated that Generation Z is deeply divided over woke ideology. Unable to afford a decent standard of living, alienated by the rise of woke ideology, and exacerbated by the loss of a sense of community and tradition, many young conservatives are increasingly inspired by the traditionalism of the past. Many Generation Z conservatives have begun flirting with radical ideologies like ethno-nationalism and neo-reactionism. As the baby boomers pass away, conservative individualism will likely face stiff competition from radical ideologies inspired by the traditional collectivism of the past. Thus, we're at a critical point in history where the mainstream media continues to focus on boomer conservatism and liberalism, while the rise of neo-traditionalism and wokeism among internet-savvy youngsters threatens to supplant them both. Although we don't know what the future will bring, we are certainly living in interesting times.